Welcome to Wife Cheating Story. I hope you have an enjoyable and relaxing time listening. Let's get started.
It started with a mug slipping from my hand, its porcelain body arcing in slow motion before shattering against the tile, a sound that might have drawn my attention under any other circumstances. But in that moment, it wasn't the crash that gripped me. It was my father's voice, booming across the kitchen, his words rattling the windows and shaking the very floor beneath my feet. "What have you done?" he demanded, and I felt the weight of every accusation in the world pressing down on my 19-year-old shoulders. I stood there, unmoving, watching jagged shards of white scatter at my feet, and I smiled, because I had expected this reaction. I had prepared my heart for the worst, and still every word cut deeper than I had imagined. My mother, Joyce, stood beside him, her arms folded and her stare cold as ice, as though I'd carved my betrayal into the family crest with my bare hands. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask about Ava. They didn't inquire whether we had thought this through or how we would manage. They only saw one thing: a boy who had thrown his life away. I closed my eyes for a moment and inhaled, tasting the acrid tang of fear laced with something else, excitement, maybe, or hope. I opened them again and saw her, Ava, my wife of nearly 6 months, pressed against the doorway behind me, her face pale but resolute. She reached for my hand, slipping her fingers around mine, and I felt her tremble. I squeezed back, faintly, so she would know she wasn't alone. But I did not turn to face her. Instead, I let my gaze travel over my parents once more, memorizing the lines of disappointment etched on their faces. I squared my shoulders and lifted my chin, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I turned away. My bag was already packed. A few changes of clothes, my textbooks, a photograph of us taken last week at the park. I had planned this day, rehearsed it in my mind while I balanced cartons at the warehouse and filled gas tanks through the night. I had anticipated everything: my father's fury, my mother's disdain, the anguish in Ava's eyes, but I had not anticipated how calm I would feel, how steady my hands. Maybe it was the adrenaline pumping through my veins, or the fierce love I felt for the tiny life growing in Ava's belly, but as I marched toward the door, I felt a fierce certainty bloom in my chest. My father called after me, his voice cracking with anger and something like fear, but I didn't look back. My mother's lips moved, forming words I could not hear, and Ava's sob caught in her throat, but still I did not waver. I stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, adjusting the strap of my worn backpack, and inhaled deeply, tasting freedom for the first time. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the driveway, but I did not feel the chill. I had a purpose now. I headed down the street without a map, trusting that the world beyond my parents' expectations would welcome me. At 16, I had dreamed of this. Of carving out my own path, of proving that I was more than a mistake, more than a disappointment. At 19, I held that dream in my hand and felt its weight like a promise. I imagined the life ahead, the small apartment Ava and I would share, the mornings we would wake to the sound of each other's breathing, the day we would meet our son, Miles, and see in his eyes our resilience, our love. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Bills to pay, nights on my feet at the gas station, the quiet ache that comes when the world seems to turn its back, but I did not fear that. I thrived on challenge, on the thrill of doing the impossible and proving that what mattered lay not in the approval of others but in the strength of my convictions. I crossed the street, passing by the old oak tree where I had played as a child, and for a moment I hesitated, pressing my palm to its rough bark. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. My father teaching me to ride a bike beneath its branches, my mother's laugh drifting down as I wobbled then fell. I pushed away the ache in my chest and opened my eyes, swallowed the lump in my throat, and turned toward the apartment complex a few blocks down. I found Ava leaning against the cracked stucco wall, her small suitcase at her feet, her eyes bright with tears. She smiled when she saw me, and my heart swelled. I took her hand and helped her with her bag, then looked down at her belly, still flat but round with promise. "We'll be okay," I whispered, and she nodded, pressing her cheek to my shoulder. Together, we walked inside, and the door clicked shut behind us, leaving the past where it belonged. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I turned the key in the lock and felt the weight of 2 new names settle on my chest: husband and father. No one back home knew what I was about to become, but here, in this empty apartment that smelled of paint thinner and possibility, I knew exactly who I was. I was a man who would not be defined by the mistakes of his parents or the whispers of a small town. I was a man with a family of my own, and my future lay ahead, vast and uncharted, waiting for us to step forward together. The first night in our apartment felt like stepping into a dream I had been too scared to articulate. The door creaked on its hinges, and the cold air that slipped and carried with it a faint chemical tang, paint thinner, I guessed, from the hurried coat of primer that still clung to the walls. The space was small, almost claustrophobic, with plaster dust dancing in the single bulb's halo and a window that rattled against its frame whenever a truck rumbled down the street. Yet as I stood in the middle of the empty living room, watching Ava press her palm against the chilled glass, a fierce sort of pride swelled inside me. This was ours by right of blood and love and stubborn determination. She turned then, her fingers threading through mine just as her rounded belly brushed against my side, and I felt the quiet thrill of partnership surge through me. Her face was pale but resolute, and I brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, marveling at how even in uncertainty she embodied grace. The unspoken question hovered between us. What now? And we answered it simply by standing together, ghosts of future laughter echoing off on adorned walls. There were no chairs, no table, not so much as a pillow on the floor, but there was a promise in the emptiness. We would fill this place with our own stories, our own hope. My shifts at the warehouse began at dawn, when the sky was still bruised with purple and orange, and I'd haul pallets beneath fluorescent lights until my muscles ached with effort. By midday, I'd return here, collapsing on the bare floor, my back against the wall, and study for my night shift at the gas station. Those 10-hour nights beneath flickering neon pumps offered little reward beyond the steady paycheck that we fed into our joint account, along with the occasional tip from a stranded driver who'd crack a smile at my tired greeting. Between deliveries and late-night pump checks, I found myself drafting plans on scrap paper, budgets and timelines, goals and contingencies. I sketched crude diagrams of shelving units we'd never buy and lists of groceries we'd never afford: milk, eggs, bread. Items that felt as exalted as fine wine. Every plan held a familiar refrain: one day, someday, when Miles arrived. But today we had only each other and the thin cotton blanket we tossed across the floor. I remember the first morning I woke here alone, the floor cold against my cheek, and how I lay there listening to Ava's soft snore in the next room, her steady breath a reminder of why I pressed on. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness, "We'll be okay." She never complained. Not once. When her morning sickness sent her pale and shaky to the couch, I returned from the warehouse to find her curled around her stomach, a damp towel at her forehead. I knelt beside her and rested my forehead on her shoulder, fumbling for words that felt inadequate. She squeezed my hand and simply said, "Thank you," and that was enough. I learned to cook simple meals: broth and rice, ginger tea steeped to ease her nausea, toast crust broken into soft pieces when her appetite returned. We survived on furtive trips to the dollar store for pasta boxes and discount vegetables, and I grew skilled at stretching a can of beans into 4 filling meals. The rent was always due, and the landlord's calls sometimes cut through our evenings like dull threats, but Ava and I faced him together, our voices firm as we negotiated one more week, one more day. I remember how, when I handed over the envelope of crumpled bills, I felt like a soldier on the front lines, holding the line against an enemy I intended to conquer. Ava would stand behind me, her hand on my shoulder, and though she said nothing, I knew her presence lent me strength. Late at night, when I returned from the gas station with my uniform crumpled and my bones weary, I'd find Ava awake, reading by the dim light of her cell phone. She'd smile at me. The kind of tired, triumphant smile that said, "You did it again." I'd slump beside her, and we'd talk about what tomorrow might bring. The growth of her belly, the weight of a new life pressing between us, the shape our love took in the small cluttered corners of this place. She dreamed aloud of holding our baby for the first time, of seeing his hands curl into fists and his eyes open wide at the world. I imagined him too, tiny and fierce, and I felt a bloom of hope in my chest that chased away the chill of those drafty walls. Our family had abandoned us. My parents refused to answer my calls or open my messages. Ava's mother had stopped returning texts, convinced that a teenage marriage and an unplanned pregnancy spelled nothing but misery. Their silence was deafening, a judgment that hung in the air like heavy water. But in that silence, Ava and I found a quiet power. We whispered promises into the darkness, promises to protect our child, to build a life worthy of his laughter, to prove every skeptic wrong. In those whispered declarations, we discovered a clarity neither of us had known before. That family was not defined by blood or approval, but by loyalty and presence. We had each other, and that was enough to kindle a fire that no amount of doubt could extinguish. As the weeks passed, I scavenged every opportunity to prepare. I repurposed a cardboard box into a makeshift cradle, insulating it with old towels and lining it with the softest fabric I could find. I researched parenting forums on my phone during breaks, bookmarking articles on swaddling and feeding schedules. When a coworker at the warehouse noticed my stash of supplies, a packet of diapers I'd scored at a discount, he gave me a bemused look, and I offered him a tight grin. "You never know," I said quietly, and he nodded, respect shining in his eyes. I carried that moment with me, a reminder that even the smallest acts of preparation could shift the world's perception. One evening, a violent storm rolled in, rattling our window and sending gusts of wind through the cracks in the frame. The bulb flickered, and the whole apartment plunged into near darkness. Ava pressed close to me, her hands trembling against my chest, and I wrapped my arms around her, shielding her from the howl of the storm. I whispered, "We're safe." And though the thunder boomed and the rain pounded the roof, I believed it with every fiber of my being. In that moment, I felt the scale of our commitment, the magnitude of the choice we had made to walk into the unknown. And I understood that whatever lay ahead, bills to pay, nights without sleep, taunts from those who thought us foolish, we would face it together. Our love would be our anchor, and our son would be our compass. When the storm passed, the early dawn light seeped through the window's cracks, and we fell asleep entwined on the floor. I woke before Ava, watching the pale blue sky inch across the dusty carpet, and in that gentle glow I saw our future waiting. It was imperfect and humble and breathtakingly real. I stood, brushed the dust from my jeans, and looked around our empty apartment, small, drafty, smelling of paint thinner. And I smiled, because for the first time I understood that home was not defined by walls or furniture, but by the people who filled it. And ours was built on love, on faith, and on a quiet, powerful belief that someday the world would recognize that we were not reckless. We were unstoppable. It started with Ava vomiting in the sink. Not the usual morning sickness, the kind we'd grown used to, the kind she'd laugh off with a weak joke and a sip of ginger tea. No, this was different. There was blood in it. Just a little, but enough for her to clutch the counter, her face pale, her breath ragged. I was across the room in seconds, my arms around her before either of us could speak. She waved me off with a shaky hand, trying to pretend it was nothing. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. That was the beginning of the unraveling, the moment I realized that love wasn't always enough. That no matter how strong we were, no matter how much we wanted this, our bodies had limits. And Ava had hit hers. The doctor's office gave us words we didn't want. Placental complications, stress-induced nausea, bed rest. Just like that, the rhythm we'd built over months fell apart. I couldn't keep both jobs anymore. The gas station let me go first, probably a blessing, though it didn't feel like it then. With only the warehouse job left, our finances bled faster than our pride could keep up. I sold my guitar, pawned my tablet. Ava cried when I traded in her engagement ring for grocery money. I kissed her knuckles and told her I didn't need jewelry to remember what we had. Still, the silence after that kiss stayed heavy between us. At night, while she slept on the futon with a pillow propped under her back, I sat on the floor and stared at spreadsheets I barely understood. I'd started online night classes a few weeks earlier. Finance, logistics, procurement, all the things I thought could build us a better life. I had no laptop, only my phone, and an aching wrist from typing out assignments between delivery shifts and diaper research. I didn't know what I was doing half the time, but I knew what I wanted, a life where I wasn't deciding between food and light. A life where Ava never had to look afraid of her own body. A life where my son, our son, could be born into more than struggle. I clung to those classes like a lifeline, believing that maybe, just maybe, knowledge could become freedom. It was a Tuesday when we decided on the name. Miles. Spelled with a Y, Ava insisted, because he's already rewriting our story. I nodded, the name settling on my chest like armor. Miles. A name with movement, with depth. I imagined him already, tiny fists, big dreams. I pictured holding him against my chest, his head resting where fear used to live. I read every article I could on newborn care, clipped coupons for diapers we couldn't yet afford, and practiced installing a borrowed car seat in the lobby of our building like it was brain surgery. The neighbors thought I was losing it. I didn't care. I wanted to be ready. When Ava went into labor, it was early. Too early. Her scream pierced the apartment at 3:17 a.m., sharp and panicked. I bolted upright, still wearing yesterday's work shirt, and saw the blood first. The sheets were soaked. I wrapped her in a blanket, carried her down 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was out, and drove like a fugitive through red lights and empty intersections. I kept talking to her the whole time, soft, steady things I wasn't even sure she could hear. You're okay. He's okay. We're okay. I said it like a chant, a prayer, a promise. I must have whispered Miles' name 100 times before we made it to the ER. The delivery was fast and brutal. Ava barely stayed conscious. Her nails dug into my forearm, and her cries tore straight through me, but I didn't flinch. I needed to be strong. I needed her to see something steady in a world spinning too fast. When he came, tiny, red, crying like a storm, I couldn't speak. I just stood there, holding on to the edge of the bassinet like it was the only thing anchoring me to the earth. A nurse asked if I wanted to cut the cord. I nodded. My hands were shaking. My heart wasn't. Miles let out this scream. High-pitched, insistent, alive, and I broke down right there in that sterile room. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew in my bones that everything had changed. They wheeled Ava away for observation, and I stayed with Miles. The nurse placed him in my arms, and for a second I couldn't breathe. He was light, impossibly so, his skin soft and warm against my chest. I whispered his name again and again, memorizing every eyelash, every wrinkle in his tiny hands. I promised him things. Some spoken, some not. That I would never leave. That I would protect him from the worst of the world. That I would teach him how to build, not just survive. Ava returned a few hours later, pale but smiling. She reached for him, and I placed our son in her arms, watching something unspoken pass between them, something sacred. The hospital let us stay for 2 days. When we brought him home, the apartment still smelled faintly of paint thinner, but now it also smelled of milk and lavender wipes and the faint sweetness of baby lotion. I held Miles through the night while Ava slept, walking the tiny space in loops, humming songs my mother used to sing before she stopped believing in me. And somewhere around 3 a.m., as his eyes fluttered closed and he burrowed into the hollow of my neck, I felt that fire again. That steady, burning hunger to become more. Not for pride, not for revenge, but for Miles, for Ava, for every cracked wall we'd leaned against, every shift we'd survived, every day we'd lived without safety nets or second chances. That was the night I knew. I would build something. With these tired hands, with this exhausted heart, I would build a life so solid that nothing, not their silence, not our poverty, not even the memories of broken mugs and shouted accusations, could tear it down. Miles slept on my chest, his heartbeat tiny and sure, and I watched the sky shift from deep blue to gray. Another morning. Another chance. And I was ready. I started with one van. Mine. A beat-up white cargo van with a dent in the rear door and rust curling along the bottom like an infection we couldn't afford to treat. It still smelled faintly of gasoline and baby wipes from when we used it to haul everything. Furniture, groceries, Ava and Miles when we had to run errands and couldn't afford gas for 2 trips. But that van became the start of something bigger. I had just been laid off from the warehouse, the second job in a year that slipped through my hands like water. There was no notice, no severance, just a look of pity from a manager who muttered something about budget cuts and how you're a hard worker, but it's a numbers game. I came home, dropped my last check on the kitchen counter, and stared at the sleeping form of my son, Miles, now barely a year old, arms curled above his head like he had no idea the world was trying to crush us. And I made a decision. If they wouldn't give me a seat at the table, I'd build a damn table myself. I used old contacts from my delivery days, clinic techs, backroom managers, a nurse who remembered I used to show up early and leave late. I started offering small deliveries. Medications, wound care packs, orthotic supplies to clinics and retirement homes around the city. I called it Oakbridge Logistics, after the little park Ava and I used to walk through when we were first dating, The one with the old oak tree bent over the wooden bridge that creaked under our feet. That name reminded me why I was doing this. I filed for an LLC at the public library, using their computers and a borrowed credit card. Printed business cards on discount stock. I didn't have an office, so I worked from the front seat of the van, our apartment, and occasionally the cafe that let me sit for hours if I bought a muffin and tipped the barista well. It was chaos at first. My schedule was a spider web of early morning drop-offs and late-night emails. Ava watched Miles while I zigzagged across town in that rickety van, clutching invoices and receipts like they were gold. She packed my lunch every morning. 2 peanut butter sandwiches, an apple, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and kissed my forehead with the kind of tired grace that only mothers know. Miles was just beginning to walk then, his tiny legs wobbling like a drunk cartoon character. Every step he took felt like a dare to the universe. I'm growing, try and stop me. I carried that energy into every deal I pitched, every contract I fought for. By the time Miles turned 1, I had 4 consistent clients and enough cash to hire my first driver, Ken, an ex-military guy with a busted shoulder and a relentless work ethic. He drove like every minute was a mission, and clients loved him. I bought a second van off a guy who ran a towing business and hadn't had time to fix it. It cost me almost everything, but we painted over the old logo and slapped on magnetic signs with our new one. Oakbridge Logistics, reliable, local, on time. It wasn't fancy, but it was real. Our living room became the nerve center. Clipboards stacked in corners, receipts taped to the wall, Miles crawling between boxes of latex gloves and sample kits. Ava joked that the couch had become my boardroom chair. I nodded, pretending to laugh, even when I was too exhausted to move. But it meant something that she said my boardroom, that she saw it, that she believed in it. We weren't wealthy, not by a long shot. But for the first time, we weren't barely surviving either. I remember standing at the grocery store, staring at a pack of name-brand diapers and really realizing, that I could afford them without mentally calculating what would be left for gas. It was the strangest kind of joy. I called Ava right there in the aisle and whispered, "We've made it." Kind of. She laughed and cried all at once. So did I. By Miles' second birthday, I had 6 employees. 3 drivers, 2 administrative assistants, 1 part-time, 1 remote, and a warehouse coordinator I couldn't believe said yes. We moved into a small rented office space with a front desk, 2 cubicles, and a fridge that smelled perpetually of tuna. It was hideous. It was perfect. I bought a second-hand desk from a liquidation sale and placed Miles' drawing, a crayon sketch of our family with the words "Daddy Trooks" right beside my monitor. That drawing anchored me through long days and longer nights. I didn't tell my parents anything. Not out of spite. Just silence. They hadn't reached out. Not even after Ava's emergency surgery when Miles was a few months old. Not when we were almost evicted that winter. Not for Miles' birth or birthdays or milestones. So I stopped checking my phone for their names. Stopped hoping. Let their absence calcify into something I didn't have to explain anymore. To them, I was still the teenage mistake who threw his life away. And I had no interest in correcting their assumption. Not yet. Then one afternoon, I walked into a downtown restaurant for a meeting with a new supplier and saw Mrs. Hartford, our old neighbor. She gasped when she saw me in a suit, carrying a leather folio and shaking hands with someone in a blazer. "Is that you?" she asked, blinking. "You look different." I just smiled and introduced myself properly, shaking her hand. "It's nice to see you again, ma'am." She glanced at my wedding ring, at the logo on my folio, and something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Or maybe pride. I don't know if she told my parents what she saw. I didn't ask. But a week later, my cousin tagged me in a post from a distant aunt, proud of young people doing big things. It wasn't much, but it was the first ripple. I went home that night and found Ava sitting on the porch with Miles curled beside her, asleep with a juice box in his hand. She looked up at me and said, "They're starting to hear about you." I sat beside her, took her hand, and looked out at our street quiet, unassuming, but ours. "Let them," I said. "We didn't build this for them, but they're going to see it anyway." She rested her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years, the fire in my chest didn't feel like pain. It felt like legacy. By the time Miles turned 5, I had stopped wondering if my parents would ever call. It wasn't bitterness anymore. It was silence that had settled into something solid, something that no longer stung. My phone never lit up with their number, Not on birthdays, not on anniversaries, not even the day Ava nearly died. That afternoon, she collapsed in the kitchen, 1 minute laughing as she made grilled cheese, the next slumping to the floor, clutching her side. The ambulance came fast. So did the surgery. Ruptured appendix. Life-threatening, they said, but we caught it in time. I sat in that hospital waiting room for 6 hours, hands trembling, phone in my lap, scrolling through every contact in my phone, passing over Mom and Dad like they were names of ghosts. I didn't call. I didn't want pity from people who'd already buried me. Miles stayed with our neighbor, and when Ava finally opened her eyes, pale and groggy but alive, I held her hand and told her I'd never let her go again. Not metaphorically. Literally. I took 3 weeks off, canceled meetings, pushed back client calls. I cooked, cleaned, nursed her back like my life depended on it. And in a way, it did. Because Ava had been there in the trenches with me since the beginning. She hadn't flinched when the eviction notice showed up. She didn't complain when we shared one jacket between the three of us that first winter. And when the world called us kids playing house, she kept building our home anyway. So no, I didn't need my parents' sympathy. I had the love I'd built, not the love I'd lost. Oakbridge Logistics kept growing. We expanded into 3 regions, then 5. My office moved from the tuna-smelling rental to a new building with floor-to-ceiling windows and conference rooms named after trees: oak, birch, redwood. I wore suits now, not for vanity, but because meetings with investors required polish. Still, I kept the old van parked behind our main facility. Rusting, barely drivable. But I couldn't let it go. That van had carried the weight of our beginning. It had been our pantry, our nursery, our mobile headquarters. My employees joked about it. I just smiled. We bought a house. Not a big, flashy one, but one with a garden Ava could lose herself in and an office that overlooked the back lawn where Miles now raced his bike in loops after school. The day we moved in, I remember walking from room to room, marveling at the sunlight hitting the hardwood floors, the echo of our laughter filling each space like a blessing. I stood in the kitchen, the one with the island Ava had always wanted, and watched her open a cabinet like she couldn't believe it was real. Miles dragged boxes upstairs, announcing each room's purpose like he was a realtor showing off a model home. That night, after he fell asleep beneath his glow-in-the-dark stars, Ava and I sat on the porch. She leaned into me and whispered, "We're not supposed to have this." I kissed her temple, which means we've earned it twice. Years slipped by. Oakbridge crossed the $1 million revenue mark. I traveled more: conferences, trade shows, expansion talks. But I never missed a single one of Miles' birthdays. I never missed a parent-teacher conference, a dentist appointment, a science fair. I was there for it all. I took pride in it. Miles once said, "Dad, you're like a superhero, but your cape is your calendar." That one stayed with me. The older he got, the more he asked questions I wasn't sure how to answer. Do I have another grandma? Why don't I see Grandpa? I always gave him the truth, edited for his age. That some people choose distance. That family isn't always kind. That love is action, not blood. He accepted it, mostly. Though once, after a classmate bragged about spending the weekend with all his grandparents, Miles came home quiet, sat on the stairs and didn't say much. I sat beside him, put my arm around his shoulders, and said, "You got the ones who stayed, kid. And sometimes, that's all that matters." He nodded. "I just wish they could see me now. See you. They'd be sorry." I looked at him, 10 years old, smart as hell, empathetic in a way that made me proud and terrified all at once. And I said, "They'd be lucky to know you, Miles. But it's not your job to make them realize it." He leaned into me, and we sat there until the sky turned dark. At work, I hired more people who reminded me of where I'd started. Young, overlooked, hungry. I paid them well, gave benefits, listened when they spoke. My COO was Ava's cousin Brian, a sharp-minded strategist who'd been jobless when we met at that barbecue. He helped us double our distribution footprint in 6 months. I brought him in not because he was family, but because he understood what it meant to be underestimated. That was our language, building empires in the shadow of doubt. Still, even with all we had, there were days I caught myself staring at my phone, wondering if maybe there'd be a voicemail. We were wrong. And I'm proud of you. It never came. Not even on the day Miles won first place in the regional science competition for designing a logistics app that mapped out delivery routes more efficiently than some of our existing software. I took a photo of him holding his certificate, his grin wide, his eyes alight with pride, and I almost sent it to my mother. I typed out the message 3 times, deleted it each time. Because I realized something as I watched Ava hugging him, her eyes misty, her smile unwavering. We weren't missing anything. They were. They missed watching Miles grow into a boy who asked questions with purpose. They missed watching Ava become the kind of woman who turned a cracked apartment into a kingdom. They missed watching me rise from factory floors and gas station shifts into boardrooms and keynote stages. And no matter how many letters they didn't write, how many milestones they ignored, they could never take any of it from us. We weren't forgotten. We were just too far ahead for them to see. And I had long stopped waiting to be seen. The summer Miles turned 10. The air felt different, like it carried the scent of possibility with the weight of something old unraveling. The nights were cooler than usual, and I remember Ava walking barefoot in the garden, her fingers brushing the tops of her tomato plants like she was trying to feel the future growing beneath her skin. Our lives had settled into something steady, maybe even soft. Oakbridge was thriving. Miles was healthy, brilliant, and bolder than I'd ever dared to be at his age. And yet, something stirred in me, a restlessness I couldn't name. I kept telling myself we had already won, that we had climbed out of the storm and now stood, finally, in the clear. But peace, I've learned, doesn't mean stillness. Sometimes it means standing long enough for the next opportunity to find you. It came in the form of an invitation from Ava's mother. A barbecue. Nothing extravagant. Just family. Those 2 words, just family, were the kind that caught in my throat like gravel. We hadn't seen her mother in years. Not since Ava's pregnancy, when she wrote us off as foolish and cut us off completely. But people change. Or maybe time just sands down the edges of bitterness until regret starts to sound like reconciliation. Ava handed me the invitation like it might bite me. I don't expect anything, she said quietly. I want Miles to know more than absence. I nodded. Not because I wanted to go, but because I wanted her to feel the thing she'd given me every single day since we were teenagers. Support without hesitation. The barbecue was at her cousin Lena's house, a modest bungalow with a sagging porch and the smell of barbecue sauce thick in the humid air. I wore a polo shirt and jeans. Miles looked sharp in a button-down he picked himself. Ava was quiet on the drive, her eyes focused on the road like she was driving into memory instead of across town. When we pulled up, I saw them on the lawn, her mother, a few cousins, an aunt or 2. Some looked surprised to see us. Others nodded like no time had passed. The first half hour was stiff. Conversations tiptoed around the past, dipping into weather and schoolwork and how tall Miles had gotten. Then Brian showed up. He was Ava's cousin on her dad's side. Older by a few years. Sharp haircut, rolled sleeves and designer sunglasses. He moved through the yard like someone who once ran boardrooms but had recently stopped pretending he still wanted to. When we were introduced, he shook my hand firmly, his eyes narrowing with recognition. You run Oakbridge, don't you? He asked. My jaw tightened, unsure where this was going. Yeah, I replied cautiously. You know it. Heard of it, he said. Actually, studied one of your route models in a seminar before I left Evergreen Logistics. Good work. That caught me off guard. Compliments didn't come easy in business. Real ones, anyway. But he said it like a peer, not a favor, not a joke. It settled something in me. We talked for nearly an hour, away from the grill smoke and gossiping uncles. Logistics, procurement trends, last-mile delivery solutions, the stuff I usually kept to myself. But Brian? He spoke my language. And more than that, he understood where I came from. He wasn't someone who'd had it easy. Burnout had shoved him out of corporate life, but ambition still simmered just beneath his surface. He asked questions like someone who wasn't done building yet. By the end of the conversation, we'd exchanged numbers. Let's talk, he said. I think we could make something happen. Back home, after Miles was asleep, Ava curled beside me on the couch, her head on my shoulder. That looked like more than polite small talk, she said. It might be, I admitted. He's smart. Knows the business. She smiled. Funny, isn't it? That all this started because your wife dragged you to a family barbecue. I laughed quietly and kissed her hair. Dragged is a strong word. Nudged gently toward fate, maybe. 2 weeks later, Brian and I met at a cafe and outlined what would become Oakbridge's first major leap. Regional expansion, starting with warehouses in 2 neighboring states. He offered to come in as COO. No ego, no grandstanding. Just structure. Experience. He had the vision and the scars. I had the momentum and the hunger. Together, we could stretch Oakbridge beyond anything I dared to dream in that paint-thinner apartment years ago. I brought the proposal to Ava before I made a move. She read through the pages carefully, flipping between charts and notes while stirring her tea. "Do you trust him?" she asked finally. "Yes," I said without pause. "And he respects what we've built. That matters." She nodded. "Then it's time." Bringing Brian on was like switching from candlelight to floodlight. He saw angles I'd missed, streamlined operations, overhauled our client onboarding, created incentive structures that kept our drivers motivated and our admin team loyal. Within 3 months, our revenue spiked. Client satisfaction climbed. And the name, Oakbridge, started showing up in articles and newsletters I hadn't even subscribed to. But the growth wasn't just external. Internally, I felt something shift. A pride that was quieter now, deeper. I stopped needing to prove myself to people who had already decided I was a mistake. My victories weren't for them. They were for Miles. For Ava. For every version of myself that once sat in a cold room, wondering how to stretch $20 across a week of bills. Brian said something once during a team meeting that stuck with me. Rejection carves out the space for the right people to fit. And maybe that was it. My parents' absence. Ava's mother's slow return. Brian's entrance. It was all part of the reshaping. Every no we received carved the outline of a better yes. Every slammed door made room for the right one to open. At the end of the summer, I stood on the deck of our new regional office, watching the trucks roll out of the lot like soldiers on mission. Miles was beside me, holding a clipboard and pretending to check inventory. He looked up at me, squinting into the sun, and said, "Dad, you ever think you'd have all this?" I looked at the warehouse, at the drivers waving as they pulled away, at the life we'd built from splinters. And I said, "No, but I knew we'd have something worth fighting for." He grinned and nodded, satisfied. "It's cool," he said, "being part of something that started with love." I didn't respond right away. I just ruffled his hair, heart full, knowing he understood something grown men often missed. This wasn't about trucks or contracts or buildings. It was about the promise we'd made in a cold, empty apartment with nothing but hope in our pockets. And now, 10 years later, that hope had a fleet. 14 years after the mug shattered and my father's voice cracked the air like thunder, I received a letter. Not an email, not a call, an actual letter. Thick paper. Familiar handwriting. My mother's. I recognized the curl of the J in Joyce before I even flipped it over. The return address was my childhood home. The place I hadn't set foot in since the day I walked out with a backpack and a wife no one wanted to acknowledge. I stood in my office when I opened it, sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Miles' drawing still framed on the shelf, the hum of voices outside reminding me of how far I'd come. I slit the envelope carefully, unsure whether it would sting or suffocate or both. The note inside was short. No long explanations. No apologies. Just this. "We would like to meet Miles. We miss you. Please consider a visit." I didn't move for a long time. Just stared at the words, trying to imagine the moment she wrote them. Was my father behind her? Did they sit at the kitchen table, hands folded like they were writing to a distant stranger? Did they argue about it first? Did they wrestle with the pride they'd clung to all these years? I didn't know. And the truth was, I didn't care. They didn't know my son. They didn't know the boy who corrected his teachers respectfully, who kissed his mom on the cheek before school every day without fail, who built a drone from scratch just to see if it could map the neighborhood from the sky. They didn't know the 10 birthdays they missed, the nights he fell asleep on my chest while Ava whispered lullabies from the doorway. They didn't know about the surgery, the milestones, the moments. They had forfeited that. I sat in the silence of my office, their letter in one hand and a photo of Miles in the other. He and I at the youth business fair last spring, both grinning, his small hands clutching the award he'd won for his logistics app prototype. My son, my reason, my legacy. My chest swelled with something that wasn't quite anger anymore. It was something colder, something measured. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't need time to think. I already knew the answer. That evening, Ava stirred sauce in the kitchen while Miles sat at the table, finishing up math homework and asking me what the square root of 576 was. 24. I answered without looking up from my phone. I was crafting the reply. Simple, clean, controlled. I printed it and sealed it in an envelope. Then I slid it across the table toward Ava. She read it once, then again. She raised an eyebrow. "You're really doing this?" she asked. I nodded. "They want to meet him. They can. On my terms." She didn't say yes or no. She just turned back to the stove and said, "Then let it be seen." The reply was one sentence: "You're welcome to visit this Saturday. Bring nothing." I chose those words deliberately, not out of spite, but because I needed them to understand that they couldn't fix this with gifts or forced apologies. They would not show up bearing cookies and stories as if the last 14 years hadn't happened. I wanted them to walk into this life they'd never asked about and see it, fully, undeniably, for what it had become. Not because I needed their approval, but because they needed to witness what their silence had cost them. I didn't tell them anything about our home, not about the modern stonework and glass entry, or the way the light hit the kitchen each morning like it was painted by some careful, loving hand. I didn't tell them Miles was on the honor roll, that Ava ran her own nonprofit now, helping teen mothers navigate a system that too often failed them. I didn't tell them about Oakbridge's new partnership with a national supplier, or that our name had appeared in Forbes under 10 small businesses to watch. I told them nothing, because if they truly wanted to know us, they would have to do what they hadn't done in 14 years, show up. That week passed like a slow tide, each day heavier than the last. Miles knew something was up. He asked if we were expecting company. I sat him down, looked him in the eyes, and told him the truth, that his grandparents wanted to meet him, that they hadn't been around, not because of him, but because they had made a choice years ago that we had never agreed with. He asked if he had to meet them. I told him no, that this was his decision too. He nodded and said, "I want to, but I want to be ready." I didn't ask what he meant. I trusted him. Saturday morning, the air was sharp and clear. Ava dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. Miles chose a gray sweater and dark slacks, like he was presenting something important. Maybe he was. I heard the car door outside before I saw them. My father's voice, lower now, age-lined. My mother's nervous laugh. I opened the door before they could knock. They froze on the porch. My father in a navy suit that didn't quite fit anymore. My mother in a shawl I vaguely remembered from church when I was a kid. Her smile was forced. His was absent. They stared past me at the home behind me, at the foyer lit by soft sconces, the hall lined with framed photographs of a family they didn't know. I didn't move to hug them, didn't reach for their coats, just said, "Come in," and stepped aside. They moved slowly, eyes darting like tourists in a museum of someone else's life. Then Miles came down the stairs, calm, measured, every bit his father's son. He walked up to them, extended his hand, and said, "Nice to meet you." They barely had time to respond before he reached into his back pocket and handed them 2 photos. One of him and me at the business fair. One of me on stage accepting the entrepreneurship award. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there, watching. My father stared at the photo, eyes glassy. My mother's hand shook. She pressed a trembling palm to her lips, and a quiet sob escaped. Miles looked up at me. I gave him the smallest nod. Then I turned to my parents and said the only thing I had waited 14 years to say. "You never asked what I'd done. Now you see it?" And in that silence, as they stood in the middle of a life they'd abandoned, I finally felt the shift. The power, the pain, the years, they were all visible now. Not explained. Not justified. Just present. And that was enough. The day I mailed that invitation, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry either. I felt like I was finally closing a door I had kept cracked open too long, hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'd peer through and see me. See Ava. See Miles. But they never did. Not until now. And so, when I wrote those 5 words, "You're welcome to visit this Saturday," I didn't lace them with warmth or bitterness. Just truth. Bring nothing, I added. Not as a command, but a boundary. No flowers. No peace offerings. No apology bundled in cellophane. If they wanted to come, they would come stripped of pretense, exposed to the life they had turned their backs on. I didn't tell them what they'd be walking into, not out of pettiness, but because I didn't need them to prepare themselves for who I had become. Let it hit them in the moment. Let them step through the door expecting to see that boy with empty pockets and instead meet the man who built something out of everything they thought would ruin him. I didn't tell them about the foyer with the clean white walls and Miles framed awards, or the long hallway lined with family photos, first steps, preschool graduations, our first vacation to the coast. I didn't tell them about the garden Ava had grown from scratch or the oak tree we planted in the backyard. the one Miles named Victory. I didn't tell them that Miles had learned to tie a tie before he was 10, that he spoke like someone twice his age and listened like someone older still. I didn't tell them Ava was running a nonprofit now, or that she'd been on the local news last month talking about youth advocacy. I didn't tell them about the community dinners we hosted, or how our neighbors always knocked when they needed help before they called anyone else. Because if they were coming to meet Miles, I wanted them to see everything not curated, not softened. Just the life they chose not to be part of. Ava asked once, quietly, cautiously, if I was sure. Not because she didn't want them to come, but because she knew what it had taken for me to become a man without their approval. I told her I wasn't inviting them back into our lives. I was giving them a chance to witness the life they'd walked away from. That was all. No promises. No do-overs. She nodded, her fingers laced in mine, and said, "Then I'll stand beside you." Like always. Saturday came fast. The house was clean, but not staged. Ava baked, not for them, but because it was something she did every Saturday. Miles practiced piano that morning, and I let the sound fill the house. If they showed up, I wanted them to hear what a decade of presence sounded like. If they didn't, well, we'd keep living. We'd already proven we could. And when the time came, I didn't pace. I didn't flinch. I just sat by the front window, waiting, not for redemption, not for reunion, just for them to see. They arrived early. Not dramatically so, but just enough to remind me of how they used to operate. 10 minutes ahead, always scanning the room like they owned it. But this wasn't their house. It wasn't their moment. My father stepped out of the car in a navy suit that clung stiffly to his frame, the tie too tight for comfort. My mother followed, clutching her purse like it might guard her from whatever waited beyond our front door. They looked up at the house. At the clean stonework, the sleek glass entry, the garden trimmed to perfection, and I watched them freeze. They hadn't expected this. Good. I opened the door before they could knock. There were no hugs, no breathless greetings. Just a heavy silence between us that said more than words ever could. "Come in," I said, and they did. Slowly, hesitantly. Their eyes darted to the staircase, the art on the walls, the hum of classical music faint in the background. I watched them take it all in like tourists in a museum of someone else's life. Then Miles appeared at the top of the stairs, calm and composed, wearing his gray sweater and navy slacks like he'd been born into moments like this. He didn't hesitate. He descended each step with quiet certainty, walked straight up to them, and extended his hand. "Hi, I'm Miles," he said, his voice clear even. My mother blinked rapidly. My father stood still. Before they could respond, Miles reached into his back pocket and pulled out 2 photos. One of us at the youth business fair where he'd won first place. One of me on stage, mid-speech, accepting the Regional Entrepreneurship Award. He handed them over without a word. My father's hands trembled slightly as he took the pictures. My mother stared at hers, mouth parting like she wanted to speak but couldn't. Her eyes welled up. My father lowered his photo slowly, his gaze locked on me now. But I wasn't waiting for their reaction. "You never asked what I'd done," I said, my voice level, steady. "Now you see it?" Miles stood beside me, tall for 10, still and proud. My mother took a step forward, as if reaching for something she'd already lost. But I didn't move. And neither did Miles. In that moment, everything they had missed, every birthday, every scraped knee, every victory and setback, hung in the space between us, undeniable and irreversible. There was no speech they could give, no tears that could undo it. There was only the truth standing right in front of them, alive, accomplished, and whole without them. We sat in the living room, not across from each other like old friends catching up, but in 2 separate worlds divided by coffee table coasters and 14 years of silence. Ava had made a pot of coffee. She didn't ask if they wanted any. She simply poured 2 mugs and set them down. No cream, no sugar, just truth served black. She didn't speak, not even when my mother whispered her name. She nodded once, took a seat on the edge of the couch beside Miles, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. That was all the grace she owed them. The room was quiet. The kind of quiet that holds its breath, waiting for someone to break it. My father cleared his throat. My mother clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles bone white. She looked around, eyes catching on the fireplace, the framed family photo above the mantel, the polished wood floors. "Your home is beautiful," she said. It wasn't an apology, but I supposed it was the closest she could offer. I nodded once. I didn't say thank you. My father leaned forward, elbows on his knees like he was preparing to deliver a sermon. "We were wrong," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly, like something inside him was fraying. We thought we were doing what was best. We didn't know how to handle it. We didn't expect." He stopped short, the words dangling in the air like they might catch fire. "You didn't expect me to survive," I finished for him. He flinched. "So did my mother." But I wasn't angry, not anymore. I was just done. "You thought I'd fall apart, that I'd come crawling back. Or worse, that I'd prove you right." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Miles sat silently beside Ava, his face unreadable, his hands resting in his lap like he was taking mental notes. "We were scared," my mother whispered. "You were so young. We thought you were throwing everything away." I stared at her for a long time. "You didn't just abandon me," I said. "You erased me. You chose pride over presence. And when you realized I didn't need you, you stayed gone." Ava shifted slightly. She didn't speak, but her hand found mine, and I squeezed it gently. She had watched me bleed in silence for years, rebuilding a life that had been dismissed before it even began. I turned back to my parents. "Forgiveness was never the problem," I said. "The problem was you gave up on me before I even had a chance." My father's lips parted, then closed again. He had nothing to say to that. Nothing that would change it. And maybe that was the point. Some things don't need to be fixed. They just need to be acknowledged. Then, from the edge of the couch, Miles spoke. "I'm glad you weren't around," he said softly. My mother turned sharply toward him, her expression folding. "What? I'm glad you weren't there," Miles repeated, eyes steady. "Because Mom and Dad did great without you. And I don't think I'd be who I am if you had been." It was the kindest, sharpest knife I had ever seen wielded in truth. And he didn't say it with cruelty. He said it like a statement of fact, because it was. My mother's shoulders sank. My father looked like he had swallowed something too big to hold. The silence that followed was full. Not angry, not bitter, just final. I stood then, walked to the door, and held it open. "Thank you for coming," I said. No emotion in my voice, just clarity. "I hope you find peace." My father stood slowly, his suit jacket wrinkled from the tension in his shoulders. My mother hesitated. "Will we see you again?" she asked. It was a question soaked in years of absence. "That depends," I replied. "Not on me. On what you do with what you saw today." They stepped outside into the afternoon light, blinking like people who'd just exited a theater they didn't understand. I didn't hug them, didn't say goodbye. I just watched them walk to their car, pause, and look back once. I closed the door before they could wave. Inside, Ava exhaled. Miles got up and walked to the kitchen. "Can we order Thai tonight?" he called. Ava laughed. "Only if you eat the broccoli this time." Life resumed. As simple and miraculous as that. I went to my office, stood by the window, and looked out at the oak tree in the backyard, the one we planted the year we bought the house. It had grown tall, branches stretching wide like it was claiming its space in the sky. Like it belonged here. Like it had never been a sapling fighting through shallow dirt and dry sun. That tree was my life. Rooted in struggle, shaped by storms, but still standing. Still growing. I didn't feel lighter. Closure doesn't float in like a breeze and carry the weight away. Closure is a door you shut yourself. Not locked, just closed. You don't wait for someone else to do it. You choose to stop waiting. And in that choosing, you find peace. I walked back to the kitchen, slipped my arms around Ava's waist as she poured tea, and kissed her cheek. She leaned into me with the kind of ease that only comes from being chosen every day. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "More than okay." Miles peeked around the corner, holding up his sketch pad. "I made a drawing of the oak tree," he said. "It looks strong." I smiled. "That's because it is." And just like that, the past didn't vanish. It just stepped aside. The boy they left behind was gone. The man who stood in his place had nothing left to prove. Only everything left to live.